Let me start with a personal opinion here, and I want you to sit with it for a second. Park rangers make less money than the guy who restocks the shelves at your local gas station. I want that to sink in. I spent 6 years wearing a green button-up with a little pine tree patch on the shoulder, driving a truck that smelled permanently like bug spray and old coffee, getting paid what amounts to "thank you for your service money." And I did it because I like trees. That's it. That's the whole resume. I like trees. I didn't want to sit in an office. And somebody at some point told me that being a park ranger meant long walks and fresh air, and maybe rescuing the occasional lost tourist who wandered off the marked trail because they wanted a selfie next to a "do not approach" sign. Nobody tells you about the paperwork. Nobody tells you that 40% of your job is writing incident reports about people who got hurt doing something so stupid that if I described it to you right now, you'd assume I was exaggerating for content. I once had a grown man break his ankle trying to pet a raccoon he was convinced was just a big friendly dog. I had to write an entire form about that, in triplicate, while he sat there insisting the raccoon started it. And the bugs. God, the bugs. I want to be very clear that no amount of hazard pay covers what a summer mosquito season does to a human body. I have donated more blood to insects than the Red Cross has ever collected from willing participants. There were nights I came home from patrol looking like I'd lost a fight with a sewing machine. So yeah, low pay, bad bugs, dumber than average visitors, a supervisor named Grady who communicates almost exclusively in disappointed sighs. That's the job. That's what I signed up for. That's what I complained about to anybody who'd listen for 6 years, like it was the worst thing that could happen to a guy who just wanted to be left alone in the woods. I want you to remember that version of me, because he's an idiot and he didn't know anything yet. There's another reason I hated that job, a real one. The kind I never told anybody, not my co-workers, not my family, not the one guy I dated for 8 months who kept asking why I flinched every time we drove past a tree line at night. I'm telling you now, and I'm telling you anonymously, because I don't have a choice anymore, and because somebody out there needs to know this stuff exists before it finds them the way it found me. So no names, no park names, no exact locations. Just take the story and do with it what you want. I don't care if you believe me. I stopped caring about that a long time ago. Here's the thing about working in a national park that most people don't think about. It's big, stupid big. The kind of big where you can drive for 40 minutes and not see another human being. Where entire sections of forest haven't had a boot print in them in years. Where the maps have blank spots that aren't blank because nobody's mapped them. They're blank because somebody decided you don't need to know what's there. I didn't think about that for the first 4 years. You get comfortable. You get complacent. The woods start to feel like your backyard, and you stop clocking the parts that don't add up. Missing hikers, for instance. Every park has them. It's tragic, but it's also just statistics. People go into the wilderness unprepared, weather turns, terrain is unforgiving. Sometimes people just don't come back, and you never find out why. That's the official story, and for a long time I believed it. Because believing the alternative meant admitting something was wrong with the place I'd built my entire adult life around. But there were details, small ones, the kind that don't mean anything on their own. A missing hiker's boots found 4 miles from his last known position, laces still tied, like he'd stepped out of them and kept walking in his socks. A radio call from another ranger, garbled, describing a sound in the trees as probably elk, except elk don't make sounds like that. And everybody on that channel knew it, and nobody said so. Incident reports that use the word wildlife so many times, it started to feel less like a description and more like a euphemism, like the word people use instead of the word they mean. I filed it all under weird but not my problem for years. That's the trick, by the way. If you ever want to survive working somewhere like this, you don't investigate. You don't ask. You cash the check and you go home and you tell yourself, the woods are just weird sometimes, and mostly, you're right. And that mostly is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. And you don't examine it too closely, because if you did, you'd have to quit. And you can't afford to quit, because see paragraph 1 about the pay. That worked for 6 years. Then it stopped working on a Tuesday in October, on a trail that wasn't supposed to have anyone on it. At 11:40 at night, 3 days before I was supposed to leave for a 2-week vacation I'd been counting down to since June. I was doing a routine gate check. Nothing dramatic, just making sure some overachieving backpacker hadn't decided to camp illegally past the closure point, which happens more than you'd think, because people see a trail closed sign the same way they see a speed limit as a suggestion aimed at other people. I had my flashlight, I had my radio, I had a granola bar I was saving as a reward for finishing the loop, and I had exactly zero expectation that anything was about to change. The forest was too quiet. I want to be precise about that because too quiet gets thrown around a lot in stories like this, and it usually just means spooky, but I mean it literally. No insects, no wind moving the canopy, no distant owl, no rustle, nothing. Just my boots on gravel and my own breathing. And I remember thinking, almost annoyed, that it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath waiting for something. And I remember thinking that was a stupid thought. And I remember being wrong about that too. That's when I heard the sound that didn't belong. And that's when I saw it standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching me back. And it was tall in a way that human bodies aren't supposed to be tall, and still in a way that living things aren't supposed to be still. And it knew exactly where I was looking before I looked there. I did the smart thing, which was absolutely nothing. I want credit for that. I have watched enough horror movies to know that the correct response to a tall, still shape at a tree line is not to scream, not to run, not to shine your flashlight directly at it like you're auditioning it for a talent show. The correct response is to freeze, breathe through your nose, and very slowly reach for the radio clipped to your chest, which is exactly what I did, right up until my hand shook so bad I dropped it, and it clattered on the gravel like a starting pistol, and the shape of the tree line tilted its head, not turned, tilted, like a bird does, like something checking an angle it hadn't considered before, and then it was gone. And I don't mean it ran. I mean 1 second it was there, and the next second the space where it had been was just trees again, and every part of my brain that deals with object permanence filed a formal complaint. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my truck in the ranger station parking lot with the doors locked, engine running, heat blasting even though it wasn't cold, and I watched my own hands shake on the steering wheel and thought, very calmly, that I had 2 options. Option 1, I tell somebody. Option 2, I don't, and I pretend this never happened, and I go on my 2-week vacation and come back and never think about it again. I went with option 1 because I am, historically, bad at making good decisions under stress. I told my supervisor, Grady, first thing the next morning in his office with the door closed, using my most professional voice, the one I save for explaining to angry tourists why they can't feed the bears. I described what I saw. Height, stillness, the tilt of the head, the way the whole forest had gone silent like someone had hit mute on it. I even had a photo blurry, useless, mostly just a smear of dark against darker trees. But a photo, something physical, something that wasn't just my word. Grady looked at the photo for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at me the way you look at someone who just told you they saw Bigfoot riding a unicycle, which, fair, I guess, except I hadn't said any of that. I'd said I saw something tall and still that didn't move like an animal, which felt like a meaningfully different claim, and he did not seem to be making that distinction. "Probably a bear standing up," he said. "Trick of the light. Happens all the time out here." I want to point out that bears do not tilt their heads like curious pigeons. I did not say this out loud because his tone had already closed the conversation. The way a door closes when someone doesn't slam it, they just quietly turn the handle and it clicks, and you understand you're not getting back in. The other rangers found out by lunch, because that's how ranger stations work. Gossip travels faster than radio signal. I got the nickname Sasquatch by 1 p.m. I got asked if I'd been drinking on shift by 2 p.m., which, insulting considering I've never once been drunk on shift. Off shift is a different story, but that's not the point. By the end of the day, I was the guy who saw a bear and thought it was a monster, and I was doing my best impression of someone who found that funny, laughing along, because the alternative was looking like the guy who actually believed what he saw, and that guy gets put on desk duty. Then Denny found me in the break room. Denny was one of the senior rangers, 20-some years in. The kind of guy who'd stop making eye contact with new hires because he'd learned most of them didn't last. He asked to see my phone. I said why. He said because Grady asked him to check something, which was already a lie. I could tell, because Grady doesn't send errand boys. Grady handles his own business badly and directly. But Denny had this look on his face that wasn't mocking, wasn't amused, wasn't any of the things everyone else's face had been doing all day. Denny looked worried, and underneath the worry, just for a second, Denny looked like a man who already knew exactly what I'd seen and had hoped, genuinely hoped, that he'd never have to have this conversation with me. I handed him the phone. Stupid, I know. But something about his face made me think handing it over was safer than not. He scrolled to the photo, looked at it for a long time, longer than Grady had, and then he deleted it. Just like that. Thumb, tap, gone, no asking, no permission. And he handed the phone back like he'd done me a favor. "You didn't see anything," he said. Not a question, not even really an order. More like a fact he was stating about the world, the way you'd tell someone the sky is blue. And I remember getting angry, actually angry, the kind of hot-faced angry where you want to say something and can't find the words fast enough, and by the time I found them, Denny was already walking away. Here's what got me, though. Denny wasn't surprised, not for 1 second. A man had just told him a coworker saw something impossible in the woods, and his reaction wasn't disbelief, wasn't mockery, wasn't even curiosity. It was procedure, like he'd done this exact thing before, like there was a protocol for it filed somewhere, dusted off and executed on a random Tuesday because a rookie adjacent ranger with 6 years in still hadn't learned to keep his mouth shut. That scared me more than the thing at the tree line had, because the thing at the tree line, I could tell myself, was one bad night, one glitch in an otherwise normal life. But Denny's face told me this was a system, and systems don't happen by accident. So I did what any reasonable person does when they realize they've stumbled into a system. I started paying attention to everything I'd spent 6 years successfully ignoring. I started noticing that certain trails got closed for maintenance that never seemed to involve any actual maintenance equipment ever showing up. I started noticing that when I pulled old incident reports for a project, a boring, legitimate project, cross-checking trail signage compliance, the kind of task designed to make you want to put your head through a filing cabinet, a disproportionate number of wildlife encounter reports described injuries that made no anatomical sense for the animals listed. Claw patterns too wide, bite radii too large. One report described a cougar attack on a man whose autopsy notes, buried 3 pages deep in language nobody was supposed to actually read, mentioned bruising consistent with something gripping him by the skull, with what the coroner's assistant had apparently, off the record, called hands. And then there was the filing cabinet, back office behind Grady's desk, gray, unremarkable. The kind of furniture you'd walk past 1,000 times without registering it exists. Except nobody ever opened it. Nobody ever mentioned it. It didn't have a label. Every other cabinet in that office was labeled permits, HR, equipment logs, and this one just sat there, blank, locked, load-bearing, in some way I didn't understand yet. I tried the handle once during a slow afternoon when Grady was out on a call. Locked, obviously. I tried it a second time 2 days later, thinking maybe I could find the key in his desk. And that's when Grady walked in and caught me with my hand literally on the handle. And I have never in my life watched a man's face go from neutral to furious to terrifyingly calm in under 3 seconds the way his did. He didn't yell. I almost wish he had. Yelling, I could have written off as him being a hard-ass. Instead, he sat down, folded his hands on the desk, and told me, very quietly, that curiosity in this job gets people reassigned. Sometimes it gets people worse than reassigned. He said it like a weather report. Matter of fact, no threat in his voice at all, which somehow made it the most threatening thing anyone had said to me in years. I said I understood. I did not understand. But I nodded and I left, and I went home and sat on my couch and made a decision that would end up costing me every ounce of peace I had left. If nobody else was going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. Quietly, off the books, on my own time. I had no idea yet how much of my own time that would end up costing. Here's a fun fact about investigating your own employer for a hidden monster management conspiracy. Nobody sells you a starter kit for that. There's no aisle at the outdoor store labeled Cryptid Surveillance Beginner. I had to improvise. I bought 4 trail cameras with my own money, the kind hunters use to catch deer patterns. And I want you to understand the indignity of standing at a checkout counter, explaining to a 16-year-old cashier that no, I wasn't hunting deer, I was hunting personal curiosity, and watching him decide, visibly, that this was not his problem, and ringing me up anyway. I also bought a notebook because I am, apparently, someone who still trusts paper more than a phone that a coworker had already proven he could reach into and delete evidence from. Old habits, paranoid habits, correct habits, as it turned out. My first move was boring, methodical, and honestly the most useful thing I did in the entire process. I pulled every missing persons case connected to the park going back 15 years, which took actual weeks, because I had to do it in scraps of time between shifts without anyone noticing what I was cross-referencing. I lined them up against trail closure dates. I want to tell you, I found some elaborate conspiracy chart with red string connecting everything like a movie. But honestly, it was worse than that, because it was so simple. Every single unexplained disappearance lined up within a few days with a trail closure logged as routine maintenance. Every one. 15 years of them. Nobody had ever needed red string because nobody had ever bothered to put the 2 lists next to each other in the first place. That's the thing about a cover-up that's been running a long time. Eventually it stops needing to be clever because everyone around it has already agreed not to look. I felt sick reading that list. Actual, physical, sit down on the kitchen floor, sick. Because these weren't statistics anymore. These were people. A woman named Ellen who went for a solo hike in March 11 years ago and left behind, according to the file, a dog that would not stop pacing the trailhead for 6 hours. A father and son who disappeared 4 years back on a trail that got closed the next morning for reasons the report never specified beyond hazard mitigation. I had walked past the memorial bench for that father and son 100 times. I had literally sat on it and eaten lunch. So I did the thing you're not supposed to do, which is get emotionally invested in your own investigation. And I started going out at night. Not on the clock, not in uniform, just me, a headlamp, a backpack full of gear I didn't fully know how to use, and a level of confidence that, looking back, was almost entirely unearned. The cameras went up on the trails that matched the closure pattern most tightly. I checked them every few nights, swapping SD cards, feeling like an idiot half the time, because for the first 2 weeks, I got nothing. Deer. A confused raccoon that seemed personally offended by the camera flash. One truly incredible 10-second clip of 2 teenagers who had clearly used a closed trail for purposes that had nothing to do with hiking and everything to do with each other. Footage I deleted immediately out of secondhand embarrassment and a strong sense that some things don't need to be evidence. Then, on a Thursday, Camera 3 gave me something else. It's hard to describe. That's the honest answer, and I'm going to keep being honest with you throughout this whole thing, even when it makes me sound unreliable, because the alternative is making stuff up to sound cooler, and I'd rather you trust me. The image was low quality, night vision grain, timestamp 2:47 a.m. There was a shape crossing the frame, low to the ground, moving on a gait that didn't match anything with 4 legs or 2 legs cleanly, more like it was deciding between the 2 mid-stride. It was there for 1 frame, and then gone. I sat in my kitchen at 6 a.m. staring at that single frame for so long my coffee went cold, and I remember laughing, actually laughing out loud, alone, at 6 a.m. because what else are you supposed to do with a piece of evidence like that? You can't call anyone, you can't post it anywhere. You can't even fully process it because your brain doesn't have a folder for gait that shouldn't exist. So it just sort of sits there in your head, unfiled, humming. That frame sent me deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone off-trail before. About 2 weeks later, on a night I'd cleared specifically because I had a hunch, based on the closure pattern, about a section of forest that didn't even have an official trail designation. It was just called, in the old maps, Unmarked Interior North Quadrant, which is the kind of phrase that should set off alarm bells and somehow, at the time, mostly just made me curious. The walk-in took 90 minutes. I remember every part of it because it was the last 90 minutes of my life where I still fundamentally believed the world worked the way I'd been taught it worked. The terrain got strange near the end. Not physically difficult, just wrong, like the trees were spaced with an intention that undisturbed forest doesn't usually have. Gaps too, even. A clearing that opened up too symmetrically for something nature does by accident. And in that clearing, there was a site. I don't have a better word for it than that. It wasn't a nest, it wasn't a den, it wasn't a human campsite. It was arranged. Stones in a pattern that repeated at intervals I could feel more than count, like my body understood the math before my brain did. Bones, some clearly animal, a few I genuinely could not place, set at the pattern's edges, like they'd been placed there on purpose, not scattered by scavengers. There was a symbol carved into the base of the largest tree, something I'd never seen before and have not been able to unsee since. And I want to tell you, I stayed calm and professional while documenting it. And instead I want to tell you the truth, which is that my hands were shaking so bad I had to brace the phone against a rock to get the photos in focus. I took maybe 40 pictures. And this time, I learned my lesson from the deleted phone photo. I emailed every single one to myself, standing right there in that clearing, watching the little upload bar crawl across a screen with one bar of signal, thinking absurdly, come on, load. While every instinct I had screamed that I should not be standing still in that clearing for one more second. The upload finished at 94%. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. Not the deer shuffle kind of movement. The kind of movement that displaces air that you feel against your face before you hear it. And I did not turn around to look. And I did not finish that upload. And I did not stop running until I was back in my truck with the doors locked and the engine on and my hands too shaky to actually put it in gear for a solid 2 minutes. I never went back to check if that email finished sending. I didn't need to. I already knew, sitting there gasping in my own driver's seat, that whatever I'd just found was real, that it was guarded, and that I had just made myself a very small, very fragile piece of evidence in a much larger story I didn't understand yet. I also knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wasn't going to stop. Here's the thing nobody tells you about deciding to sell evidence of impossible creatures to shadowy government-adjacent buyers. You can't just Google it. Believe me, I tried at 2 a.m. with 3 tabs open, typing search queries so unhinged I'm honestly relieved my browser history isn't admissible in court. Who buys cryptid evidence? Government cryptid contact number. Men in black actual phone number, not a joke. I got forums. I got a guy in Nevada who wanted $500 to channel information from something he called the Star Council. I did not call the guy in Nevada. What actually worked was dumber and slower and made me feel, for the first time, like I was in one of those movies where the protagonist realizes the underworld isn't hidden, it's just quiet, and it's been standing next to him the whole time wearing a normal person's face. It started with Denny. Not because Denny helped me. Denny would sooner set himself on fire than help me, but because Denny let something slip, once, in a moment of pure irritation. When I cornered him about the filing cabinet again, and he snapped at me to stop acting like you're the first ranger to ever try calling the number. I latched onto that sentence like a dog on a bone. The number. What number? He wouldn't say, but I now knew a number existed, and knowing something exists is 90% of finding it, which is a lesson I'd apply a lot over the following months. I spent the next few weeks doing something I can only describe as extremely low-rent detective work. I bought drinks for retired rangers at a bar 40 minutes outside the park boundary, guys who'd put in their 20 and gotten out and had loosened tongues and nothing left to lose. Most of them clammed up the second I got specific, but one guy, I'll call him Pete because that's not his name, got drunk enough and nostalgic enough, and bitter enough about a pension dispute to tell me that if you ever find something you can't explain, and you want it gone, and you want it to pay, there's a hardware store off Route 9 that isn't really a hardware store on Tuesdays. I want you to sit with how insane that sentence is. A hardware store that isn't really a hardware store on Tuesdays. I drove out there the following Tuesday at 5 in the morning like an idiot, sat in the parking lot in my truck with a thermos of coffee, and watched absolutely nothing happen for 2 hours except a guy restocking bags of mulch. I went back the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. On the third Tuesday at 6:04 a.m., a plain gray sedan pulled into the lot, parked in a spot with no obvious relationship to the store entrance, and a man got out. I want to describe him accurately, because he's going to be important for the rest of this story, and because he does not look like what you'd expect. He looked like an accountant, mid-40s, tan windbreaker, the kind of haircut that doesn't have an opinion about itself. A face so unremarkable, I have genuinely struggled to describe it to myself in the months since, like my brain refuses to hold on to the details. He didn't look around. He didn't scan the lot for threats like a movie spy. He just walked toward the store entrance like a man running an errand. I got out of my truck. I don't fully know why. Some instinct, some certainty that this was the moment, and if I let it pass, I'd be back here every Tuesday for the rest of my life, drinking gas station coffee and getting nowhere. I said, "Excuse me," in the least threatening voice I own, and he stopped, and he turned, and he looked at me with an expression that had absolutely no surprise in it whatsoever. Like he'd been expecting someone to eventually walk up to him in this exact parking lot and had simply been waiting to find out who. I told him everything. Fast, rambling, probably not in the right order, the thing at the tree line, the deleted photo, the filing cabinet, the missing persons pattern, the site in the woods, the shape in the clearing. He listened to all of it without blinking. I mean that almost literally. I have stared at a lot of unsettling things over the past 8 months, and I will tell you, this man's stillness while listening ranks disturbingly high on that list, right up there with actual monsters, which tells you something about how the human nervous system prioritizes threats. When I finished, he didn't ask a single follow-up question. He reached into his windbreaker, pulled out a plain white card with nothing on it but a phone number, no name, no logo, and held it out. "Call this when you have something physical," he said. His voice matched his face. Forgettable, efficient. I asked what he meant by physical. Pictures weren't physical? The site wasn't physical? He didn't answer that. He got back in the sedan, and the sedan pulled out of the lot with the unhurried calm of a man who had somewhere to be, but wasn't worried about being late. And I stood there in a hardware store parking lot at 6:06 in the morning holding a blank card with a phone number on it, and I remember thinking very clearly, this is the part of the story where I should turn around and go home and pretend none of this ever happened. I did not do that. Instead, I stood there running his sentence back through my head. Call this when you have something physical. And I felt the full weight of what he was actually asking me to do settle into my stomach like a stone. Not photograph it, not report it, catch it. He wanted the thing itself, alive, or at least intact enough to matter, delivered like a package. No questions asked about how I managed it, because clearly that wasn't his department. His department was showing up afterward with a checkbook and a face that never changed expression. I got back in my truck and I sat there for a long time with the card resting on the dashboard, and I did the math anyone would do in my position. Which is a bad kind of math, the kind where you tell yourself it's just information gathering, you're not agreeing to anything yet, you're just seeing what's possible, and underneath that math, quieter was the real math, the one about my rent and my truck payment, and the fact that a government-adjacent man in a windbreaker had just implied, without saying it directly, that whatever I brought him would be worth an amount of money that made park ranger's salary look like a joke someone was playing on me. I put the card in my glove box. I told myself I was keeping my options open. I was lying to myself, obviously. I'd already agreed to something the second I got out of that truck to say excuse me. I just hadn't figured out yet what I was going to have to become in order to actually pull it off. So here's a question I never expected to have to answer in my adult life. How do you catch something you don't have a name for, using equipment designed for tranquilizing black bears, when you have received exactly zero training in cryptid containment because that class does not exist anywhere in any state, at any community college? The answer is badly. You do it badly, at least at first. I need to back up and explain the tranquilizer gun situation because it's a whole thing. The park keeps one on site, locked in a case in the equipment shed, for the rare occasions when a bear wanders somewhere it shouldn't and needs to be relocated instead of destroyed. Checking it out requires a supervisor's sign-off and a logged reason. I did not have a reason a supervisor would sign off on, so I told Grady I'd gotten a tip about an aggressive black bear near the eastern boundary, described in just enough detail to sound plausible, not so much detail that he'd want to come look himself. Grady, who at this point mostly just wanted me out of his office as fast as possible, signed off without really looking up from his desk. I felt bad about the lie for approximately 4 seconds. Then I remembered I was about to go hunt something with hands that grips human skulls, and the guilt evaporated pretty fast after that. I'd been running my night cameras for 3 more weeks by then, refining my sense of where things moved and when, and I'd settled on a stretch of trail near camera 3, the one that had caught that single impossible frame, as my best shot. I picked a night with a full moon, which I thought was smart for visibility and which turned out to matter for a completely different reason I did not anticipate. I want to walk you through this capture in order because the order is the whole comedy of it, honestly. I got into position around 11 p.m., crouched behind a fallen log with a tranquilizer rifle across my knees, wearing dark clothes like I was auditioning for a role in a movie about a guy who has clearly never done this before, which, correct casting. I had a thermos, I had a granola bar. I had at no point a plan for what happens after the tranquilizer actually hits something. Around 1 a.m. I heard the gate, the wrong gate, the one from the footage, closing in from my left, moving with that same unsettling indecision between 2 legs and 4. My hands started shaking almost immediately, which is a genuinely terrible trait to have while holding a loaded weapon. And I want to be honest that my first shot missed by what I can only assume was several feet, because the dart buried itself in a tree with a thwack, loud enough that I'm fairly certain it heard me before it saw me. Then it turned toward me and I got my first real look at it, and I need you to understand that not what I was expecting does not wean in to cover it. I'd built up an image in my head from the sight, the bones, the symbol, something monstrous and animal. What came toward me instead was almost human. Almost. The proportions were close enough to trick your eye for half a second before your brain caught up and started screaming that the joints bent wrong, that the face had the right number of features in slightly the wrong places, like something built from a description of a person rather than an actual person, assembled by someone who'd only ever heard about human anatomy secondhand. I fired again. This time I hit it, more by luck than skill, in the shoulder. And it did not go down gracefully. It went down the way anything alive goes down when it's suddenly full of sedative, which is to say clumsily, and partway through falling, it lunged, and I did the single most embarrassing thing I have done in this entire process, which is that I tripped backward over the log I'd been using as cover, and fired my second dart directly into my own left thigh. I want to be very clear that being partially tranquilized while trying to subdue something that might also be partially tranquilized is an experience I would not recommend to anyone under any circumstances. My leg went warm and heavy within about 90 seconds. The thing I still didn't have a name for it, I still don't have a good one, was on the ground about 8 feet away, twitching, not fully out. I had maybe a 2-minute window before we were both a liability to ourselves, and somewhere in that fog, my body decided the smartest move was to belly crawl toward it, dragging a roll of paracord I'd brought for a completely different, much less insane purpose. I got it tied. I genuinely do not remember most of the specifics, which worries me in retrospect, but I got it tied well enough, and I got myself upright well enough, using the log I'd tripped over as leverage, and I dragged the both of us, my numb leg included, back toward the truck over what felt like the longest half-mile of my life. Loading it into the truck bed involved a tarp, a lot of swearing, one moment where it half woke and made a sound I still hear sometimes when I can't sleep, and me nearly dropping it directly onto my own numb foot, which would have been a genuinely stupid way to end my brief career as a cryptid hunter. I called the number from the glove box at 2:40 a.m., legs still tingling, hands shaking so bad I had to try 3 times to unlock my phone. The man answered on the second ring. I told him I had something. He asked if it was contained. I said yes, mostly, in a tone that probably didn't inspire confidence. He asked for my location. I gave it. He said 40 minutes and hung up before I could ask any of the 400 questions I had. They arrived in 31. I counted. 2 black SUVs, no sirens, no lights, 4 people who moved like they'd done this so many times it had become choreography, professional in a way that made my duct tape and desperation approach look like a children's birthday party. They didn't ask me a single question about how I'd caught it. They just checked it, murmured to each other in a shorthand I couldn't follow, and loaded it into a container that had clearly been designed for exactly this purpose, which raised more questions than it answered about how long this operation had existed and how many other idiots like me had come before. The man in the windbreaker got out of the second SUV last, walked over, looked at the tranquilizer dart still visibly sticking out of my own thigh, and said nothing about it. He just handed me a check. I looked at the number on it. Then I looked at him. Then I said something along the lines of, "You know, for a guy who doesn't exist, your handwriting's pretty good." Which did not get a laugh, did not get a smile, did not get any reaction at all. Beyond him getting back into the SUV and the convoy pulling away as quietly as it arrived. I stood there in the dark, one leg mostly asleep, holding a check with more zeros on it than I'd made in the past 2 years combined, and I thought about my tranquilizer rifle, still lying in the dirt somewhere behind me, standard bear grade, single shot. Clearly not built for whatever that thing had actually been. I was going to need a bigger gun. The problem with suddenly having money is that money leaves evidence, and evidence is the one thing I'd spent the last several months learning to be terrified of. I couldn't exactly deposit a check with that many zeros into my normal bank account without somebody at some point asking questions I didn't have good answers for. So my first move as a newly minted cryptid mercenary was, embarrassingly, opening a second bank account at a credit union 2 towns over, using my middle name, like I was some kind of amateur criminal, which, fair, I was. The bigger, more immediate problem was my body. I looked like I'd lost a fight with a wood chipper. Scratches down one forearm from the paracord incident, a bruise on my thigh the color of a ripe eggplant from where I'd shot myself with my own tranquilizer dart, a limp I was doing a genuinely terrible job of hiding. I came into the station the next morning, and Casey, I hadn't really registered her as a person up to this point, just a name on the schedule. One of the newer hires who kept mostly to herself gave me a look across the break room that lasted about 2 seconds too long for comfort. I brushed it off as fell off my porch, which is the kind of lie that sounds convincing exactly 0% of the time, and somehow nobody questioned it. Possibly because questioning my competence had become such a running joke at the station that clumsy idiot injures himself doing nothing fit the established narrative perfectly. Small mercies. The equipment damage reports were harder to explain away. I'd borrowed the tranquilizer rifle under a bear pretext and returned it with a dart missing that I obviously couldn't account for, plus a scope that had gotten knocked out of alignment during the whole belly-crawling while sedated portion of the evening. I filed a report that basically amounted to bear was more aggressive than anticipated, which was, generously, 40% true. Grady called me into his office about 2 weeks later. I want to describe this conversation because it's genuinely one of the funnier moments in an otherwise increasingly not funny few months. He had my equipment reports spread out on his desk, 3 of them by then, each one vaguer and more suspicious than the last, and he looked at me with the specific weariness of a man who has managed the same difficult employee for 6 years and has run out of new ways to be disappointed. "You want to tell me what's actually going on with you?" he said. I said no, not really, but I appreciated him asking. He did not find that funny. He sat there for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk, and then he said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. He said, "I've seen this before. Guys who start disappearing off hours. Guys who come back looking like they went 10 rounds with something. It doesn't end well for them, usually. And then he stopped himself, visibly like he'd said more than he meant to, and told me to get my act together and get back to work, and that was it. Conversation over. I've thought about that sentence a lot since. I've seen this before. It meant there'd been others. It meant Grady wasn't just a guy protecting institutional secrets out of loyalty or fear. He'd watched people go down this exact road before me, and something about the way he said "doesn't end well" made it clear he wasn't talking about them getting fired. I filed that away with everything else I wasn't dealing with, which by this point was a genuinely impressive backlog of things I was actively choosing not to deal with, and went back to work like nothing had happened, which is a skill I was getting disturbingly good at. Casey caught up with me on a trail about 4 days later. I was doing a routine signage check, minding my own business, replaying the Grady conversation in my head for probably the 40th time, and she just fell into step beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world, which immediately put me on guard, because nothing about our working relationship up to that point had involved casual trail walking small talk. "I've seen things too," she said. No preamble, just that, dropped into the conversation like she was commenting on the weather. I want to be honest about my reaction, because it wasn't gratitude, it wasn't relief at finally not being alone in this. It was suspicion, immediate and total. My brain went through the calculation fast. She's new, she's been quiet, she's suddenly interested in me, right after I've started acting erratic and filing weird equipment reports. Either she genuinely stumbled onto something on her own, or Grady sent her to figure out how much I actually know, and I had absolutely no way of telling which. So I gave her nothing. I said something vague about the woods being weird sometimes, deflected with a joke about the raccoon petting guy, and changed the subject to trail maintenance schedules with the enthusiasm of a man trying very hard to seem boring. She let it go, didn't push. But right before she peeled off toward her own assigned section, she said one more thing, quiet. Almost like she was talking to herself, a trail designation, a date, numbers and letters that meant nothing to me in the moment. Delivered so casually, I almost missed their weight entirely. And then she was gone, back to her patrol like nothing had happened. I went home that night and looked it up, cross-referenced it against my own notes, my own map of closures and disappearances, the whole ugly spreadsheet I'd been building for months. It was the site, the exact coordinates near enough of the arranged clearing I'd found in the deep woods, the one with the symbol and the bones and the thing that had come at me out of the dark before my email finished uploading. Except the date attached to it was 15 years older than the day I found it. 15 years. Which meant whatever that site was, whatever it meant, it had been there long before I ever laced up a pair of ranger boots. And Casey knew about it, and Casey had just handed it to me like a test I hadn't known I was taking. And I sat there on my kitchen floor with my laptop glowing in the dark, feeling the exact same thing I'd felt reading the missing persons list weeks earlier. That sick, cold understanding that the ground I'd been standing on my whole career was never as solid as I'd let myself believe. I want to tell you, I had a solid plan before heading back out to that trail designation Casey gave me, but solid plan has never really been my brand, and this was no exception. What I had was a date, a set of coordinates 15 years old, a growing certainty that Casey either did or didn't work for my supervisor, and an unbearable itch that meant I was going regardless of how badly thought out the whole thing was. I went in daylight this time, which felt like a small, dumb act of self-preservation. Like the sun was going to protect me from something that had already demonstrated it didn't care what time it was. I told myself I was just going to look, confirm the location, not linger. I have never once in my life successfully just looked at anything, so take that promise for what it was worth. The walk out there felt different from my first trip to the site. Less like discovery, more like returning somewhere I'd already been in a dream. The clearing was there, same stones, same unsettling geometry, and for a second I almost convinced myself nothing had changed since my last visit, that I was just retracing old ground. Then I noticed the trail markers, not official park markers, something older, half swallowed by moss, metal stakes driven into the ground at intervals that matched disturbingly well the intervals of the stone arrangement itself. I followed them out from the clearing, and they led me maybe 200 yards further in, to a spot where the ground dipped slightly and the trees thinned in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. There was a bunker there. I don't have a better word for it. Half-buried concrete, old enough that moss had claimed most of the exposed surface, with a rusted metal door that had clearly been forced open at some point in the past and never resealed. My stomach did the thing where it drops through the floor and keeps going, because a bunker isn't a natural phenomenon. A bunker is infrastructure. A bunker means somebody built something here on purpose a long time ago, with intention, with a budget, with people who signed off on it. I went inside, because of course I did. The flashlight on my phone showed me a narrow concrete hallway, water damage creeping up the walls and rooms branching off it that had clearly been some kind of monitoring station once. Rusted equipment racks, the husks of old radio gear that looked military grade, decades out of date. A wall in the second room, covered in a hand-drawn map of the park that didn't match any official map I'd ever seen, with symbols marked at specific points, the same symbol I'd found carved into the tree back at the clearing, repeated over and over across the map like a rash. This wasn't a cover-up. A cover-up is reactive. A cover-up is Denny deleting a photo, Grady signing an official report with the word wildlife, doing a lot of unfair work. This was infrastructure. This was decades of planning, budget, staffing, maintenance. Someone, some agency, some department, something with letterhead and funding lines, had built a network specifically to monitor and manage whatever lived out here. Not react to it, manage it. Like pest control, except the pests were things that shouldn't exist, and the management had been running quietly under the floor of a public national park for longer than I'd been alive. I thought about Grady's filing cabinet. I thought about Denny's face, the practiced calm of a man executing procedure rather than expressing surprise. I thought about the man in the windbreaker, unshaken by anything I'd told him in that parking lot, like he'd heard versions of my story 100 times before, from 100 other idiots just like me. And for the first time, standing in that damp concrete hallway, I let myself consider a possibility that had been circling the edges of my brain for weeks without ever landing directly. What if the Park Service and the man who didn't exist weren't separate things I'd stumbled between? What if they were the same machine wearing two different faces, and I'd just spent months thinking I was playing outside the rules when actually I'd been playing exactly the role the rules had left open for me? That thought made me feel very suddenly, very small, like a piece being moved by a hand I couldn't see. I found one more thing in that third room, in a metal cabinet that had somehow survived the water damage better than everything around it. A single manila folder, more recent than everything else in that place by decades, clean edges, no mold, sitting there like it had been placed deliberately for someone to find. It had my name on it, not a name close to mine, not a coincidence. My actual full name, printed on the tab in the same bland institutional font as every other government form I'd ever filled out in my life, sitting in a half-collapsed bunker 15 years older than my entire employment history, in a room nobody was supposed to know existed. I did not open it there. I want to be honest that some primal part of my brain refused to let me open it in that concrete hallway with the light fading and my phone battery dropping, and the possibility, however small, that something out there in the trees knew exactly where I was standing. I took it. I put it inside my jacket like it might burn a hole through my chest if I held it too long, and I walked out of that bunker at a pace just short of running. And I did not look back at the tree line even once, which took more discipline than anything else I'd done in this entire process. I got home, I locked the door, I checked the lock twice, then a third time, which I have never done in my life before that night. I put the folder on my kitchen table and sat down across from it like it was a person I was about to interrogate, and I stared at it for a long time before I could make myself reach out and open the cover. The folder had my whole life in it. That's not an exaggeration I'm using for effect. I mean, it had my actual, literal life. laid out in the flat bureaucratic language of someone who'd been watching me for a lot longer than I wanted to think about while sitting alone at my kitchen table at 11 at night. My background check was first. Standard stuff, the kind every ranger goes through before getting hired, but this version had annotations in the margins, handwritten, in a hand I didn't recognize, little notes that read less like security clearance concerns and more like someone grading my personality. Resourceful under pressure. Prone to insubordination when bored. High tolerance for discomfort, low tolerance for authority he doesn't respect. I want to say I was offended. Mostly I was just unsettled by how accurate it was. Then there was a psychological profile I had absolutely no memory of ever consenting to, which used words like adaptive risk tolerance and situational resilience to describe what I would have described, more honestly, as makes bad decisions fast and somehow survives them. There were notes from what I assume was some kind of standardized evaluation every new ranger takes and never thinks about again, cross-referenced against something called a field viability index, a phrase that meant nothing to me and everything to whoever had written it. The worst part was the recent stuff, notes from Grady, actual handwritten notes dated across the last several months, tracking my increased independent activity in restricted zones, my unauthorized equipment requisitions, my elevated risk behavior consistent with pre-recruitment escalation, which is a genuinely horrifying phrase to read about yourself, because it means someone had a name for exactly what I was doing before I even fully understood I was doing it. There was a note dated the week after I first talked to the man in the windbreaker. It read in Grady's blocky handwriting, "Contact likely made. Recommend continued observation. No direct intervention." No direct intervention. He knew. He'd known the whole time. Watch me lie about a bear, watch me limp into work covered in scratches, watch me file increasingly deranged equipment reports, and instead of stopping any of it, he'd just let it happen. Documented it, passed the documentation up a chain I still couldn't see the top of. The last page was a recommendation form, official looking, though for an organization with no name printed anywhere on it, which felt like its own kind of joke. It recommended me by name, by employee ID, by a case number I'd apparently been assigned without my knowledge, for something called formal integration, pending demonstrated field capability, which I now understood, with a nauseating clarity, meant exactly what I thought it meant. They'd been waiting to see if I could actually catch something. My capture wasn't a spontaneous act of desperate improvisation. It was a test I hadn't known I was taking, and I'd apparently passed. The man in the windbreaker wasn't a lucky break I'd stumbled onto through a drunk retired ranger and a hardware store that isn't a hardware store on Tuesdays. He was the next scripted step. The card in the parking lot wasn't a tip from a stranger who happened to believe me. It was an audition slip, handed out according to a process that had clearly been refined over a long time on a lot of people who'd walked this exact same path before me and either passed or didn't. I sat with that for longer than I want to admit. The folder just sitting there on the table, the kitchen light humming, my coffee gone cold for the second time that week in exactly this scenario, staring at evidence that my entire journey of discovery had actually been somebody else's carefully managed onboarding process. Then I called the number. He picked up on the first ring, which at this point I'd started to expect, but which still managed to unsettle me every single time, like he was always just sitting there waiting, phone in hand, with nothing better to do than wait for me specifically to call. I didn't bother with small talk. I asked him directly if I'd been recruited before I ever agreed to anything. He didn't deny it. That's the part that got me not a flicker of defensiveness, not even the performance of surprise. He just said, calmly, that I had a choice now. Come in officially, be part of the program, or keep freelancing on my own, outside whatever protections that came with actually being inside the system. I asked what the difference was. He said without a hint of irony, officially, you get health insurance. I laughed. I genuinely laughed, alone in my kitchen at midnight, holding a file that proved a shadow agency had been quietly evaluating my psychological profile for years. Because after everything, the monster at the tree line, the deleted photo, the bunker, the folder with my name on it. The thing that finally broke my composure was a joke about dental coverage. I told him I'd think about it. He said take my time, in a tone that suggested he already knew exactly how much time that would actually be, and hung up. I sat there another 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling, doing absolutely no productive thinking whatsoever. And then, because apparently the only functional coping mechanism I have left at this point in my life is walking directly back into mortal danger, I grabbed my gear, checked the truck bed for the new equipment I'd bought with Cryptid money, and went back out into the dark to go catch something else. I needed to think. Turns out, for me, near-death clarity works better than actual sleep. That's probably a sign of something. I chose not to examine what. With hindsight, going back out that same night was, even by my standards, an unusually bad idea. And I want to walk you through exactly how bad, because this is the night everything stopped being manageable. I'd upgraded my gear by then. Cryptid money bought a better tranquilizer rifle, one actually rated for something bigger than Black Bear, plus a thermal scope that made me feel, for about 45 minutes, like a genuine professional instead of a guy who accidentally darted his own leg 2 months prior. I picked a new stretch of woods further from anything I'd touched before, based on a pattern I'd noticed in Casey's coordinates. Clusters of activity that seemed to orbit a central point I hadn't located yet, like moons around a planet I couldn't see. I want to tell you I noticed I was being followed sooner than I actually did. The truth is, I didn't clock it until I was already deep in, maybe 2 hours out, moving through terrain that had started to feel wrong in that specific way I'd learned to recognize too quiet, too still, the woods holding their breath again. I heard something behind me, turned, saw nothing, kept moving, told myself it was fine. That thing rangers do where you convince yourself the forest is just doing forest things. 20 minutes later, I heard something to my left. Then, a while after that, ahead of me, which was the moment my brain finally, belatedly, caught up to the very obvious fact that I wasn't hearing 3 separate animals. I was hearing one thing moving around me in a slow, patient, deliberate circle. It had been herding me. I didn't understand toward what until I checked my GPS and realized the little blue dot marking my position was no longer anywhere near the trail I'd set out to follow. I'd been walked, step by step, without ever consciously choosing to change direction, into a ravine I did not recognize, with steep rock walls on 2 sides and a single narrow gap behind me that I suddenly, with total clarity, understood was about to become the only way out. It came out of the tree line ahead of me first. Casually, almost, like it had all the time in the world, because it did. Because it had just spent the better part of 2 hours proving exactly that. This wasn't the almost human thing from my first capture. This was bigger, wrong in different ways, moving low and fast when it wanted to, and standing unnervingly upright when it didn't. And it looked at me the way you look at something you've already caught and are simply deciding how to finish handling. I fired, missed badly, my hands doing the shaking thing again, muscle memory abandoning me exactly when I needed it most. It closed the distance faster than anything that size should be able to move, and I did the only thing my body could think to do, which was throw myself sideways into the rock wall hard enough to knock the wind out of me. And I felt something in my shoulder given away that I knew immediately, with total clarity, was going to be a problem later, if there was a later. I got one more shot off from the ground, awkward, half-blind from pain, and it connected. I don't know how. I genuinely think it was closer to prayer than aim, but it didn't drop the thing. It just slowed it, staggered it, bought me maybe 4 seconds I did not know how to use. Here's where the improvisation comes in, and I want to be honest that clever is doing some generous lifting in that word, because what I actually did was grab the only other tool I had on me, a road flare I'd packed on a whim months ago for a completely unrelated reason and never used. And I lit it and threw it directly at the thing's face with my one working arm. And it flinched, actually flinched, hard enough that it gave me the half second I needed to scramble backward into a gap in the rock wall, too narrow for it to follow. I want to tell you that was a brilliant tactical decision. It was not. It was the last idea my adrenaline-soaked brain had access to, and it happened to work, and there's a version of tonight where it doesn't, and I'm not writing this at all. I sat wedged in that gap for what felt like an hour, shoulders screaming, listening to something enormous pace back and forth on the other side of a rock wall that suddenly felt a lot thinner than I wanted it to be. And I genuinely, fully believed for a solid stretch of that hour that this was it, that I'd finally found the thing my luck couldn't outrun. I thought about my apartment, my truck payment, the second bank account under my middle name that nobody would ever think to check, and I thought, absurdly, about how nobody would even know to look for me in this ravine, because officially, I wasn't even supposed to be out here. It left eventually. I don't know why. Maybe it got bored. Maybe something else drew its attention. I didn't ask questions. I just used the opening to half crawl, half stumble back the way I'd come, favoring the shoulder, and I called the number the second I had a signal, voice shaking in a way I didn't even try to hide this time. They got there fast, faster than usual. And this time, for the first time, it wasn't just clean professional silence from the team. One of them, a woman in tactical gear who I'd never seen before, crouched down next to me while the others worked and said, quietly, almost like she wasn't supposed to, that whatever I'd run into tonight wasn't in their catalog, that they hadn't seen its kind before, that I should be careful going forward because apparently even the organization with a bunker network and decades of infrastructure didn't have a category for what had just spent 2 hours quietly herding me into a dead end for fun. That was the first time anyone from that world had spoken to me like a person instead of a transaction. It should have made me feel better. It didn't. My shoulder ended up being a partial dislocation, which I discovered by trying to explain to an urgent care doctor at 4 a.m. how exactly I'd hurt it, and settling on fell hiking, a lie so thin it barely qualified as one, delivered to a nurse who had clearly heard worse and cared less. I got a sling. I got told to take it easy for 2 weeks. I did not take it easy for 2 weeks, obviously, because apparently my body had decided that resting was a personality trait other people got to have. Casey found me in the break room 3 days later, arm still in the sling, and this time I didn't deflect. I don't know exactly what flipped that switch, maybe the ravine, maybe the folder with my name on it, maybe just the exhaustion of carrying all of it alone for months while pretending at work that everything was fine. Whatever it was, I told her. All of it. The tree line, the site, the bunker, the man in the windbreaker, the folder, the ravine, the thing that had no category. I watched her face while I talked, waiting for the moment she'd react like a normal person reacts to a story like that, and it never came. She just nodded occasionally, like she was checking items off a list she'd already half-written herself. Then she told me what she knew, and the picture I'd been building for months suddenly got a lot bigger and a lot worse. Casey had been tracking something too, on her own, quietly, for longer than I'd realized. Not creatures specifically. Patterns of avoidance. Every cryptid sighting she'd logged, every strange track, every disturbed site. When she plotted them out, they all moved the same direction, away from a single point deep in the park's interior, a point she'd never actually been to herself, and didn't know anyone who had, and come back the same. I asked how she knew that last part. She said because she'd asked around, carefully, the same slow, paranoid way I had. And every lead she followed eventually hit the same wall. Somebody who used to work a certain section, who transferred out abruptly, who wouldn't talk about why, who now flinched visibly if you brought up a certain trail designation. Rangers who'd gone in and come back different, quieter, changed in a way nobody could quite name, but everybody around them noticed. She thought the other creatures the almost human thing, the thing in the ravine, all of it were afraid of whatever was at that point. That their entire territorial behavior, the herding, the avoidance patterns baked into the geography of the whole park, revolved around staying away from it, the way smaller predators arrange their whole lives around staying out of a bigger one's path. I sat with that for a long moment, because up to now, my whole framework, dumb as it sounds to say out loud, had been monsters exist. They're dangerous, catch them carefully, sell them for money. A closed system, manageable even in the same grim way A dangerous job can be manageable once you understand its rules. What Casey was describing broke that framework entirely. If the things I'd been catching were themselves afraid of something else, then I hadn't been operating at the top of a food chain. I'd been operating somewhere comfortably in the middle of one, congratulating myself on catching mid-tier threats, while something at the actual top sat undisturbed at the center of the map, old enough and patient enough that even the monsters gave it a wide berth. I asked Casey if she wanted to go there with me. She said no. Flat, immediate, no hesitation at all. Which from Casey, who up to this point had shown zero fear about anything I'd described to her, told me more than any explanation could have. She said she'd spent 2 years working up the nerve to even get close to that section of the map, and every time, something in her gut told her no with a force she'd learned the hard way not to argue with. I've never been good at listening to that kind of instinct. I told her I understood and I meant it, and then I made a decision I already knew, even as I was making it, she was going to think was a mistake. I decided I was going to go anyway. Not that week, not immediately, my shoulder still wasn't fully right, and even I have some minimal sense of self-preservation, buried somewhere under several layers of bad decision-making. But I started preparing. Extra batteries, a backup GPS, since something told me the electronics weren't going to behave once I got close, based on the way Casey described her own attempts to even map the area's signal drift, compasses behaving strangely, the same kind of interference I remembered from my own walk to the arranged site months earlier. Except worse, she said, the deeper you tried to go. I didn't call the man in the windbreaker about any of this. I told myself that was because I didn't have anything physical yet. Nothing to report, no reason to bring him in. The more honest reason, the one I didn't want to sit with too long, was that some part of me suspected that whatever was at that point in the map wasn't something his organization actually wanted found. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And I wasn't ready to find out what happened to people who found things that organization preferred to leave alone. So I kept it to myself. Just me and the map. And a growing, uncomfortable certainty that I'd spent the last several months thinking I was climbing some kind of ladder, gaining ground, understanding more of the world I'd stumbled into, when actually I'd just been circling the outer edge of something much older, much larger, and much more patient than anything else I'd encountered so far. I want to tell you, I waited until my shoulder fully healed before going to the point on Casey's map. I did not. I waited exactly as long as my own impatience allowed, which turned out to be about 10 days. Sling mostly discarded, arms still stiff in a way that made carrying gear an unpleasant reminder of my last outing, and then I went. Alone. Because Casey had made her position clear, and because some part of me, the same part that had gotten me into every single bad decision documented in this story so far, didn't want a witness for this one. The walk-in started normal enough, if anything about my life at this point could be called normal. About 90 minutes into it, the GPS started drifting. Not failing outright, that would have been easier to process, honestly. A clean malfunction I could shrug off as bad electronics. Instead, it did something worse. It kept working, kept updating, kept showing me a location. Except the location it showed didn't match the terrain I could see with my own eyes. According to the screen, I was walking in a straight line. According to my legs and my knees, and the incline I was very much feeling, I was climbing. I kept my compass as backup, old school, the kind that doesn't care about satellites. It started drifting too, slow at first, then faster, the needle swinging in lazy, loose circles, like it had given up trying to find north and settled for just spinning politely instead. The sound dropped out gradually. That's the detail that stayed with me the longest, honestly, more than almost anything else that happened out there. It wasn't sudden silence, the way it had been that first night at the tree line. It was gradual, a slow fade. Birds first, then wind, then the ambient hum of insects, until I realized at some point that I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually heard anything at all. And my own footsteps had started to sound muffled, wrong, like I was walking through a recording of a forest rather than an actual one. I kept moving anyway, obviously. I don't fully know how to describe what I found, and I want to be honest with you about that instead of dressing it up with language that makes it sound more coherent than it actually was. There wasn't a clearing, not exactly, not the way the arranged site had been a clearing. The trees just stopped being trees, in a way I can't fully account for. Not cut down, not burned, just absent in a wide, rough circle, like something had erased them rather than removed them, and at the center of that circle there was a presence. I keep using that word because it's the only one that fits. Not a shape, not a creature I could describe in terms of limbs or eyes or any of the anatomical vocabulary I'd built up cataloging everything else I'd encountered. It was more like a wrongness with a location, a place where the air itself felt like it was being observed rather than occupied, and I stood there at the edge of that dead circle feeling smaller than I have ever felt in my entire life. Smaller than during the ravine, smaller than staring at my own name on that file in the bunker. I made a joke. I want you to know that, because it's the most honest thing I can tell you about who I am. Even standing at the edge of something my whole nervous system was screaming was beyond anything I had a framework for. Some reflex in me still reached for a joke, muttered under my breath, something about how I really hoped this wasn't going to end with me joining whatever book club it apparently ran out here. It didn't land. Not with the presence, obviously, and honestly, not really with me either. My voice came out thin and strange in that dead air, swallowed almost before it left my mouth. I did not go closer. I want to be very clear about that, because up to this point in the story, I have made almost nothing but bad decisions, and I need you to understand that some deep, ancient part of my brain finally, for the first time in 8 months, overrode every impulse toward curiosity or greed or professional obligation and simply said no. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter and more absolute than fear. A certainty, total and complete, that whatever stood at the center of that circle was not in a category that had a before or after for me. There was no capturing it. There was no selling it. There was no framework in which I survived trying. I turned around and walked back out, slowly, deliberately, every cell in my body screaming at me to run. And I did not run, because some instinct even deeper than the survival instinct told me that running would mean acknowledging it as a threat that could be outrun. And I understood, without understanding how I understood it, that this was not that kind of thing. I got back to my truck. I sat there for a long time before my hands were steady enough to drive. Then I called the number. He answered on the first ring, same as always. I told him there was something at the center of the park he needed to know about, and I heard my own voice shaking as I said it. There was a long pause on his end, longer than I'd ever heard from him before, long enough that I almost asked if he was still there. "I already know," he said. I asked what they were doing about it. "Nothing," he said. I asked why. There was another pause, shorter this time. And then he said the only thing he's ever said to me that sounded, even slightly, like it cost him something to say out loud. Because it was there first. I didn't sleep much for the next few days. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the specific kind of insomnia that comes from having your entire understanding of a situation rearranged overnight. I'd spent months building a mental map where I was, at worst, a small fish swimming near some larger fish. Dangerous, but ultimately comprehensible. What I'd learned at that dead circle in the trees was that the map itself had a border, and the thing on the other side of that border didn't play by any of the rules. Everything inside it did. It didn't need to be understood. It didn't need to be caught. It had just always been there, patient and total. The way a mountain is there, and everything else, the almost human thing, the ravine creature, the entire hidden bunker network, the man in the windbreaker's whole organization was just smaller life, arranging itself around a fact it had learned a very long time ago not to test. I went back to work because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I want to describe what that was like, because it's a strange kind of grief. Going through the motions of a job that used to feel mundane, standing at the same trailhead kiosks, checking the same permits, nodding at the same tourists, asking the same questions about bear safety, while carrying something in my chest that none of them could see and I could never explain. My coworkers noticed something was off. even the ones who'd spent the last several months treating me as the department punchline. The jokes about Sasquatch tapered off, not out of kindness, I don't think, but because even people who don't know what's actually happening can sense when something in a person has shifted permanently, and it makes the old jokes feel wrong to keep telling, the way you stop teasing someone about a haircut once you find out their dog died. Casey watched me across the break room a lot during that stretch. I could feel her wanting to ask, could see the question sitting right behind her eyes every single time our shifts overlapped, and every single time she held it back, which I appreciated more than I probably ever told her, because I genuinely did not have the words ready yet to answer it. Grady called me into his office again about a week after I went to the point. I walked in expecting the usual, a warning, a threat delivered in that calm weather report voice of his. Maybe finally the reassignment he'd hinted at all those months ago. What I got instead was different, and it threw me more than anger would have. He didn't sit behind his desk this time. He gestured for me to sit, and he sat across from me instead of behind the desk, which felt significant in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Some small shift in the geometry of authority between us that told me this conversation was going to be different from every other one we'd had. "You went to the center," he said. Not a question. I asked how he knew. He said he always knew. That there was a whole system built, decades deep, for tracking exactly this, who went near it, who came back different. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. This vast, invisible bureaucracy of monitoring wrapped around a piece of forest most of the public would never think twice about. Then he told me something that reframed the entire 6 years I'd spent working there, and I want to relay it to you as close to how he said it as I can remember, because I've turned this conversation over in my head more times than almost anything else that's happened to me. He said the park was never just a park, that it had never been just a park. Not since long before either of us were born, not since long before the land was ever designated a park in the first place. He said the things in it, the almost human creature, the ravine thing, all the cataloged and uncatalogued and unnamed things scattered across that hidden wall of photographs I hadn't seen yet, but would soon weren't anomalies intruding on a normal ecosystem. They were residents. They belonged there in a way that predated every human claim to the land, every fence, every visitor center, every ranger badge, including mine. He said the actual job, the one that never appears in any brochure, the one that isn't written into any job posting, the one underneath the trail maintenance and the tourist safety and the bear relocations, was to keep two populations separated, human and otherwise. That the whole apparatus, the closures, the incident reports full of euphemisms, the filing cabinet nobody talked about, the bunker network I'd stumbled into, all of it existed for exactly one purpose: management of the boundary between what the public was allowed to know existed and what had always, quietly, actually been sharing the land with them. I asked him what happens when that boundary fails, when the two populations aren't kept separate anymore. He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window of his office instead, toward the tree line most people driving past would never think twice about, for long enough that I started to wonder if he was going to answer at all. He never did finish answering that question, not that day. He just said, eventually, in a voice that had lost all its usual weariness and replaced it with something closer to exhaustion, that I'd find out eventually, that everybody in this job finds out eventually, and that he hoped for my sake it would be a smaller version of finding out rather than a big one. I did not have to wait long to find out which version I got. It happened on a Thursday, which felt insultingly mundane for how the day ended. I was off duty, actually off duty for once, sitting in my apartment eating cereal for dinner, like the balanced adult I clearly am, when my phone started blowing up with notifications from the local town's community Facebook group, a place I normally ignored entirely except for the occasional lost dog post. Except this wasn't a lost dog. This was 3 separate videos, shaky, low quality, all showing the same thing from slightly different angles. Something moving through the parking lot of the grocery store on the edge of town, low and fast. Definitely not a bear. Definitely not anything anyone in that comment section had a category for, though that didn't stop about 200 people from confidently guessing anyway. I called Grady before he called me. which felt like a personal victory under the circumstances. He already knew. Of course, he already knew. He told me the situation, fast and clipped, all business now. None of the philosophical weight of our last conversation left in his voice. Something had crossed the boundary, made it out of the park and into the adjacent town. And there were now multiple civilian witnesses and a rapidly growing pile of phone footage climbing toward viral status. He said we had maybe 3 hours before this stopped being a manageable local weirdness story and turned into something no amount of quiet management could contain. He told me he was sending me and Casey together, officially. I want to pause on that word, officially, because it landed strange. For months, I'd been operating in the shadows of this whole system, freelancing, off the books, catching things on my own time for a man who didn't officially exist. This was the first time anyone had actually deployed me as part of the machine itself. And it came with an adrenaline I hadn't expected, a strange flicker of validation buried under the very real terror of the actual situation. Casey met me at the trailhead lot in under 15 minutes, already geared up, already grim-faced in a way that told me she understood exactly how serious this was, even before I filled her in on the details. Working with her officially, side by side instead of trading cryptic hallway conversations, turned out to be its own kind of revelation. She moved like someone who'd been quietly training for this longer than I had, calm under pressure in a way I have never once been. And about 20 minutes into us tracking the thing's path through backyards and drainage ditches on the edge of town, I realized with something close to relief that I finally had a partner who wasn't going to trip over her own feet and shoot herself with a tranquilizer dart. We found it before anyone official did, crouched behind a row of dumpsters near a strip mall, disoriented, clearly as confused about being there as the 200 commenters guessing about it online. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision before somebody with a phone rounded that corner and turned confused local Facebook group into national news. I called the number, told the man the situation, fast, the way you talk when the clock is actually real for once and not just a feeling. He said flatly that he couldn't authorize sending a team into a populated area in broad daylight. Too many witnesses, too much exposure, the exact kind of scenario his whole organization existed to prevent, which meant infuriatingly that the organization built to handle exactly this situation had a built-in blind spot for exactly this situation. I asked what he suggested instead. He was quiet, actually quiet, for the first time since I'd known him. No immediate procedural answer ready to go, which told me everything I needed to know about how far outside normal operating parameters this had actually gone. So I made a call of my own, unilateral, against my agreement with him, against every instinct Grady had spent months trying to install in me about waiting for proper channels, against basically every piece of institutional caution anyone in this entire hidden world had tried to teach me. I'm not going to walk you through every detail of what I actually did, partly because it involved borrowing a delivery van from a very confused restaurant owner under a pretext I still feel guilty about, and partly because some of it genuinely does not reflect well on my judgment even by my own extremely low standards for judgment at this point. What matters is that it worked, barely, messily. With Casey improvising just as hard as I was, the two of us functioning less like trained professionals and more like two people trying to solve a very dangerous puzzle using whatever was lying around a suburban strip mall parking lot. The cleanup afterward was its own kind of chaos, actual containment team arriving 20 minutes too late to do anything but manage the aftermath. Several very confused witnesses given a story about an escaped exotic animal from a traveling show that nobody quite believed but everybody was willing to accept because the alternative was worse. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a local news crew already on scene for an unrelated story caught 2 seconds of me in the background of a live shot. Ranger uniform, clearly exhausted, clearly involved in something I had no plausible explanation for. I called the man again that night, told him about the news footage. He didn't say much, just told me to send him the segment timestamp, and by the next morning it had vanished from every platform it had ever touched, scrubbed with an efficiency that told me, once again, exactly how much reach this organization actually had. I sat in my apartment afterward, adrenaline finally draining out of me, and thought, with a strange kind of numb clarity, that I had just gone rogue against a secret government-adjacent organization on behalf of a secret government-adjacent organization in defense of a town that would never know how close it came to something much worse. And somehow I was going to have to explain some version of this to Grady in the morning. Grady called me in first thing the next morning, and I walked into that office fully expecting to get fired. I'd rehearsed it in my head on the drive over, honestly. Some version of dignified acceptance, maybe a joke on the way out the door about updating my resume to include unauthorized cryptid containment, strip mall division. Instead, he told me the man who doesn't exist had put in an official request. For me, by name. A joint operation, whatever that meant in practice, which apparently meant something significant enough that it had gone over Grady's head entirely, decided somewhere well above his pay grade, presented to him not as a question, but as a notification. He was not happy about this. I want to be fair to Grady here, because underneath the 6 years of gruff disappointment and vague threats, there was something almost sincere in the way he talked to me that morning, a real, if reluctant, sense of responsibility for the people under him, even the ones who lied about aggressive bears to check out tranquilizer rifles. He gave me a whole speech about loyalty, about what the Ranger Service actually meant underneath the brochures and the trail maps, about how the people who built that bunker network decades ago had done it specifically so that guys like the man in the windbreaker could pluck Rangers out whenever it suited them, and how every single time that happened, the park lost someone who actually understood the land, replaced by someone who now belonged to a much bigger, much colder machine. I listened. I actually listened. No jokes, no deflection, because for once I understood exactly how much weight was behind what he was saying. And when he finished, I told him I was going to accept the joint operation anyway. He nodded like he'd expected that answer the whole time. Maybe he had. Maybe that's the same nod he'd given every ranger before me who'd sat in that same chair making the same decision, which is a thought I try not to dwell on too much. My first meeting with the full team happened 3 days later, at a location I'm not going to describe beyond saying it was nowhere near anything I'd have guessed, and nothing like the small, quiet capture site operations I'd gotten used to. This wasn't 4 people in tactical gear stepping out of black SUVs. This was an actual organization with actual scale, the kind of thing that requires budget lines and staffing rosters, and apparently a surprisingly normal-looking break room with a surprisingly bad coffee machine, which felt like an oddly comforting detail in the middle of all the surrounding weirdness. There were scientists, people in lab coats hunched over specimens I made a point of not looking at too closely. There were analysts at rows of monitors, cross-referencing data I couldn't begin to parse. There was a briefing room, and in that briefing room there were maps of the park that made every map I'd ever used in 6 years of employment look like a child's drawing. Layers of annotation, historical incident overlays, zones marked in colors that clearly meant something specific to everyone in that room except me. And there was a wall, floor to ceiling, covered in photographs, organized in a grid that took up the entire far side of the room. Creatures I had never seen, never heard of, never imagined, cataloged with the same flat clinical labeling as everything else in that world. Dozens of them, maybe more. An entire taxonomy of things that officially did not exist, quietly documented over what must have been decades of exactly the kind of work I'd been stumbling through alone for the past 8 months. I was looking at that wall, genuinely a little dizzy from the scale of it, when something in the corner of one photograph caught my eye. Small, easy to miss if you weren't already primed to recognize it. But I was primed to recognize it because I'd seen it carved into a tree at the edge of a clearing 8 months ago. The same symbol repeated across a hand-drawn map in a half-collapsed bunker. The same shape that had been sitting somewhere in the back of my mind ever since, waiting for context I never quite got. It was there, in the background of that photograph, faint, half-obscured, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. I must not have hidden my reaction well, because the analyst standing nearest to that section of the wall glanced over, followed my eyeline for half a second, and then, without a word, without any acknowledgement at all, quietly closed the folder sitting open on the table beneath that photograph and moved it out of view. I didn't say anything either. I've learned over the past 8 months exactly when saying something gets you answers and exactly when it just tells the room you noticed something you weren't supposed to notice. And this was clearly the second kind of moment. So I filed it away. The way I'd filed away Grady's "I've seen this before." The way I'd filed away the man's "it was there" first. Another small piece of a much bigger picture that I was apparently never going to be given all at once, only in careful, deliberate fragments, exactly as much as somebody somewhere had decided I was ready to handle. I said nothing. I nodded along with the rest of the briefing, took notes I barely processed, and left that facility with a distinct, uncomfortable feeling that I had just been shown exactly enough to keep me curious and exactly little enough to keep me controlled. I've gotten pretty familiar with that feeling by now. It doesn't get easier, it just gets more familiar. So here's where things actually stand right now, which is a strange thing to try to summarize, because nothing about my life resolved the way stories are supposed to resolve. There was no final boss, no clean ending where I learned the truth and rode off into a sunset with a neat little bow on it. What I got instead is this. I'm still here, still doing the job, still somehow complaining about basically all the same things I was complaining about at the very start of this, which I think says more about human nature than it does about anything supernatural. The bugs are still terrible. I want that on the record. You'd think working alongside an actual secret organization that catalogs impossible creatures would come with better mosquito repellent. It does not. I am still, 8 months and 1 joint operation later, donating more blood to insects than I've ever donated to a blood bank, and no amount of government-adjacent budget apparently extends to bug spray procurement. The pay is better, obviously. Cryptid money doesn't disappear just because I've technically gone legitimate, but I want to be honest that better doesn't mean enough. Nothing is enough for what this job actually asks of a person. I don't think there's a number that would be. I've stopped doing the math on that mostly because doing the math just makes me angry, and being angry doesn't help anybody dart anything faster. My coworkers are still, on the whole, mostly insufferable, though the specific flavor of insufferable has shifted. Nobody calls me Sasquatch anymore. Now there's just a kind of wary respect mixed with obvious confusion about what exactly I do now that half my shifts involve disappearing for special assignments nobody's allowed to ask about, which somehow manages to be even more annoying than the old jokes were. Casey's the exception to all of that, and I'll admit it here even though admitting things is not really my strong suit. She's the best partner I've had through any of this, steadier than me, sharper than me, and considerably less likely to shoot herself in the leg with her own equipment, which is admittedly a low bar, but one I respect her for clearing so consistently. We work together officially now, most of the time, which took some getting used to after months of doing everything solo, but I'm not going to pretend I don't sleep better on nights. I know she's the one covering my back instead of nobody. The man who doesn't exist is still the most unsettling person I have ever met. And I want that to mean something coming from someone who has, at this point, had a prolonged staring contest with something that did not have eyes to stare back with. He still answers on the first ring. He still hands over checks without changing expression. He still says things like, "It was there first," in a tone that makes it clear that sentence is doing about 90% more work than its 5 words suggest. And he has never once in 8 months given me an answer that didn't come with 3 new questions attached. The thing at the point in the park is still there. Nobody's doing anything about it. Nobody, as far as I can tell, is even trying. It just sits there at the center of everything, patient in a way nothing patient should be allowed to be. And the whole sprawling machine I've become a part of, the bunkers, the analysts, the wall of photographs, all of it arranges itself carefully, permanently, around not touching it. I think about that a lot more than I'd like to. 3 days ago, something left a mark on my truck. I want to be precise about this because it matters, not a scratch. Not the kind of damage you get from a stray branch on a bad parking job. A mark, deliberate, placed, the same symbol from the clearing, the same one from the bunker map, the same one I caught out of the corner of my eye in that photograph on the wall, scratched into the tailgate at a height that meant whatever left it had been standing right there, close enough to touch my truck, close enough that I never heard it, close enough that I have no idea how long it watched before it left. I photographed it immediately, no hesitation this time, no waiting around to see if it would sit still long enough for a second shot. I sent it to myself by email, right there in the driveway. The same trick I learned the hard way 8 months ago. I sent it to Casey too, because at this point, that's just what you do. You don't sit on things alone anymore, not when sitting on things alone is how all of this started in the first place. Then I called the number. He answered, same as always. But this time there was a pause before he spoke, longer than the usual pause, longer than the pause after I told him about the presence at the center of the park, and for a second I actually thought the line had dropped. Then he said he'd send someone to look at it. I asked if I should be worried. He said I should probably buy a bigger truck. That's it. That's where I actually am right now, as I'm telling you this, sitting in a dealership lot on my day off, scrolling listings, trying to figure out what exactly qualifies as big enough for whatever's coming next, because apparently that's the actual practical advice you get from the most powerful shadow organization in the country when something marks your vehicle with a symbol tied to the oldest, most patient thing in the entire park. I don't know what this next part is going to be. I never do. That's honestly the most consistent thing about this whole story. I keep thinking I've reached the edge of what's possible, and it keeps showing me there's more edge I haven't found yet. So, if you're reading this, and something starts leaving marks near your place that you can't explain, do yourself a favor. Don't investigate it alone. Don't wait to see if it's nothing. And maybe start shopping for a bigger truck too, just in case.